Please take your seats. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming on this dreary day to what will be a wonderful event for us this evening. I am Amir Pasik. I am the Eugene R. Temple Dean of the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and I am glad that you are here with us for the third event in our Stead Lecture Series. You are in for a transatlantic treat tonight. We have a leading scholar with us who is at home on both sides of the North Atlantic. And on both shores, there are social and political developments that are far from being business as usual. And in these interesting times, we look for insight into the quality and the appropriate role of our civic life. I think this is precisely the kind of discussion that we hope to nurture with the Stead Lecture. The Stead Lecture was made possible by the Stead Family Chair in International Philanthropy. It was the result of a gift from Jerry and Mary Joy Stead and their family through their foundation. Its goal was to establish global understanding of philanthropy across borders and within cultures around the world. Tonight, we are honored to welcome our third visitor in this series, following thought-provoking events with Reynold Levy, now president of the Robin Hood Foundation, and Ken Pruitt of Columbia University. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors for their support. I'd like to thank the American Council of Germany, as well as the Indiana University Office of the Vice President of International Affairs. And I'd like to recognize some special guests. We have Sven Schumacher, the Honorary Consul of Germany, and I don't see Diane Thomas in the audience. She is the Honorary Consul of France. I'm sure she will join us shortly. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Helmut Anheier. He is President and Dean of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin and is a leading expert on international civil society. He holds a chair of sociology at Heidelberg University and is academic director of the Center for Social Investment. He founded and directed the Center for Civil Society at London School of Economics and the Center for Civil Society at UCLA. He received his PhD from Yale University. He was a senior researcher at Johns Hopkins University's School of Public Policy, a professor of public policy and social welfare at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, and he also served as Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics. As you see, he's always looking for the hidden institutions in terms of his travels around the world. Before embarking on an academic career, he served as Social Affairs Officer of the United Nations. He is author of more than 400 publications and has won international prizes in recognition for his scholarship. Among his recent book publications is The Global Studies Encyclopedia with Mark Juergensmeyer, and he's the principal academic lead of the Hertie School's annual governance report. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anheier.
So much. Yeah, thank you very much for your kind words. It makes me blush. To some extent, it sounds like a guy who can't keep a job, right? But it's a pleasure and honor being here and seeing so many friends and colleagues in the audience is just an added honor to having been invited. I have put together a PowerPoint presentation, and I would like to take you on a journey around the world a bit. And my topic is global civil society or transnational civil society. The rough agenda is that I will introduce the topic, then we look at empirics. We will compare what you might say was the state of global civil society. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. In 2000 and what it is like now in the early, we're in 2016, but the data I have go back to, are usually about 2013, 2014. Right? And then I conclude and highlight a number of issues. there's still quite a lot of confusion about what civil society is and what it is not. Some people equate it with the non-profit sector, but it's much more. I'm very much behind these two definitions that you have, one by Ernest Gellner and the other one by John Keane. I think they capture very well what I see also at the essence of global civil society. Right? So civil society is, in the words of Gellner, almost a countervailing force, a balancing item between the state and the market. Right? And it's also a bit of a conflictual image that you see reflected there, where the state or government has a tendency to overpower society and markets have a tendency to atomize society, and civil society holds both at bay. And at the same time, civil society is in tension not only with these other institutional complexes, but also internally in itself. Civil society never has one voice. It has multiple voices. Right? And that's what John Keane, I think, expresses very well, that you have this ensemble of institutions that are permanently in tensions with each other and with the state. At the same time, the state has to frame and has to constrict and enable the activities of civil society. So that's the way I look at civil society, but it's also very abstract, you see, the way John Keane and Ernest Gellner describe it or define it. So we used in the work on global civil society an operational definition. Right? You see it defined there, and we look for particular elements or expressions of civil society. So an institutional infrastructure of NGOs, forums, events, and increasingly, of course, web-based platforms. There are values that we associate with civil society, like civility. And there's individual behavior, right? It's engaging, it's participating, it's volunteering. And identities. Identities in this case would be that you see yourself not only as the citizen of the city where you are or the country where you live in, but you have a broader identity, almost as some would call it, a cosmopolitan identity. Right? So these would be the constituting elements of civil society in an operational way. Now, let's look at a number of let's look at data. This is the growth of international NGOs starting in the year 1900 till the year 2000. And these are organizations, NGOs, that operate in at least 3 countries. So they are, you might say, the tip of the iceberg. Right? If you operate an NGO from Indianapolis and you work in Canada only, you would not be in that data set. Right? But if you work in the US and in 2 other countries and you have a permanent presence there, not only projects, right, then you would be counted in that data set. And you can easily see that there has been a significant increase in the number of INGOs, and a lot of that increase has been in the latter part of the 20th century, in particular, starting in the mid-70s and after 1989. So, and it coincides with the economic globalization spurt that we experienced and with the greater spread of the rule of law in many countries around the world. And I already now indicated 2 of the drivers behind global civil society. That's economic globalization and the rule of law. And keep those in mind when we come back to the issues that should concern us today. This is what happened in the last 20 years, a closer look at it. Many expected that the growth of nonprofits, of these INGOs, right, would decline somewhat after the events of 9/11. They have indeed. The growth rate has slowed significantly. And this is just a rough indication, but you can see between 1994 and 97, in those 3 years, we added 10,000 of these organizations, and it took us a decade to do the same between 2003 and 2013. So we're still adding to the institutional infrastructure of transnational civil society, but at a slower rate. And the question is, of course, why? Right? Now, keep in mind, we're talking about a great diversity of organizations here. There are these very large charities, there are learned societies, there are advocacy groups, there are social movement organizations, there are foundations. Right? So it's not it's a very diverse group, and they don't have one voice, and they have very, very different organizational designs. Here is a prototypical international non-profit organizations amnesty. Right? And I want you to appreciate the scale or the size of this organization, and also the complexity that is behind them. It's 1 million people around the world in 140 countries are active in Amnesty International. Right? This is Friends of the Earth. It's 61 groups with an international secretariat, 5,000 local groups and 1 million members. It's a highly decentralized network. Right? So you can think of these organizations not as one entity, but that they are like a network spread around the globe. Not evenly, and that's part of the story, but they are widely dispersed. So this is an organizational map of Friends of the Earth. And if you were to draw a similar map for a transnational corporation, it would probably look quite similar. Right? Here is a newer example of the Coalition Against Child Soldiers, which is a coalition of 6 international NGOs with various UN organizations. Right? And that's what they look like. So what we began to observe in really already in the 90s and well into 2000s was that we have these decentralized federations of non-profit organizations emerging, right? And they became less, they looked less like what you have here with the international campaign to ban landmines. They became more, which is a very radial structure, right? With a center in, I think they're located near New York City, and all the chapters are spread around the world. But they began to look more like organizations that have multiple headquarters with various structures attached to it that have either consultative or some associate role to them. So this is the Coalition for an International Criminal Court. You can see that it looks very different from what we had up here, right? And the point I want to make is that something like the Climate Action Network of a decentralized multiple headquarter federation, right, is what we are going to see more of in future. And they have various properties that helps them a lot. They can cut down on transaction costs. They have much better information management. And we argued back in the about 5 or 10 years ago that we would see more of these federations, and indeed that's what we are seeing. Woody Powell at Stanford has argued that the network organizations, the highly decentralized, devolved organization, is the one that we would see more in the global age. And I think nonprofits are just replicating this pattern that you also see in the business world. And we also saw a greater rise of forums. Many of you have heard about the social forum, the World Social Forum in Allegra, that started in, I think, in the early 2000s, and set in motion a phenomenon where people congregate, they come together for 2 days, for a week, and they debate. It's very deliberative, right? And that multiplied, not only at the global level, but at the regional level. And they're connected. And we hadn't had this kind of phenomenon of fora to that extent before, right? And then we have the dot causes, and I'll say more about those dot causes. So these are internet-based platforms that are largely used for advocacy work. Right? Conventional NGOs also use that, but they use that to present themselves, and they use it for fundraising, they use it for many, many purposes. But to have these new kind of internet-based, we can't really call them organizations, right? They are platforms. That was a phenomenon that started in the 90s and has taken off since then I will say more about this. So the idea of comparing global civil society in 15, 16 years ago to what it is today, the first thing I want you to keep in mind is that we had a differentiation happening. Right? It had longer roots, but it's happening more. We get federations, we get fora, and these dark causes. The dark causes have a history going back to 95-96, when the Free Burma campaign happened, was one of the first political mobilizations that used the internet. Shell Ogoni in Nigeria, 96. Critical was the Zapatistas' use of the internet in southern Mexico. And the Obama campaign I put there because the Obama campaign spread outside the borders of the United States. There was actually a significant international mobilization for Obama. Of course, they couldn't vote, but they nonetheless expressed their support of it. And then with the financial crisis, we get platforms like Occupy and Anonymous. Right? So that is new. New is also the extent to which we can use the internet for mobilization. Now, many of us will recall the day of global protest against the war in Iraq, and it doesn't matter where you stand on that war, looking back, or where you stood about the war then. It was a significant event. It was the largest event of human mobilization to date. Right? And it was done without centralized authority, and it happened by local groups loosely connected via the internet. And if you see the spread of these groups, it is actually quite remarkable. So it's an indication. You see, I'm not saying that this is global civil society, because it indicates a potential for what can be mobilized across borders using cyberspace. That was also a very significant event. The Iraq elections, the Iran elections in 2009, that were one of the first elections that were heavily twittered. And Iran is, of course, not a democracy, but you did have this twittering happening, and most of it happened outside the country. Right? These movements have come up, which we didn't quite anticipate 15, 16 years ago. Occupy, of course, is a reaction to the global financial market structure that is seen as unjust. Right? And here you can argue, well, it's a protest site, but what do they actually achieve with it? I don't think it would be easy to disregard or to argue that Occupy hasn't really achieved anything compared to the financial markets, right? But that's not the point at all. Right? Many NGOs have been in existence for a long, long time, and you can ask what have they achieved when they engage in advocacy work. Sometimes you have to be on a topic for a long, long, long time. This is Attack. Now, Attack has been very, very effective, because Attack is initially a French website, was the first successful case of internet-based mobilization against a piece of legislation. When the OECD was charged to set up this mutual agreement on investments in the late 90s, it was Attack spearheading the mobilization against it, and they succeeded because we don't have that agreement. Right? So it does have an impact. So what did we know in 2001? Yes, we had an expansion of the institutional infrastructure. We had more NGOs than ever before. We also had more philanthropy. I didn't go into that, but that's part and parcel of it. We had the beginnings of important form developments, as I outlined. We did have a value shift towards post-materialism in some parts of the world, but not in others. So a value shift towards more values of civility, respecting the other, of tolerance, right? We could actually see that the world is becoming more civil. We did have more connectivity in the way that people could reach across borders and reach out to each other, facilitated again by advances in IT. And while identities were fairly stable over long periods of time, we did have a slow rise of cosmopolitan values, particularly in Europe. So that was 15 years ago. In 2002, I developed with a colleague at the LSE a Global Civil Society Index. And that index is grounded in that operational definition I showed to you at the very beginning, right? So we have values, we have participation, and we have infrastructure. So infrastructure would include the NGO density in a country, participation of the political participation of the population, in politics having to do with international topics, right? And participation in or membership in civil society organizations that also have an international intent. That's how we constructed that part, and the other one is the civility index, largely taken from the World Value Survey and similar population surveys, and it looks at tolerance and encouragement of tolerance in children. Right? So what came out of that is the following. You always see a color indicator at the bottom, and then you see countries having different colors. So here, the darker the color, the stronger is this aspect of civil society. But keep in mind, we're only measuring here the international aspect of civil society, not civil society as a whole. And then there are countries that are yellow, that would be weaker, right? And countries white means that we have no data. Now, you will see a number of charts because we were able to maps because we could do it in 2002 and we can do it in 2010. And there is quite a bit of a movement, but it's usually not more towards the blue whenever you look more north and east, but in the south and west you see improvement. So Latin America, for example, is doing better. Large parts of Asia are not. This is what it looks like in Europe, but since we're not in Europe, I'm going to skip that. This is the civility index. You know, again, the darker, the more we find values of civility. So that's tolerance vis-a-vis the other, the stranger, and tolerance as a value that you want to encourage in your children. And it has also a rather similar tendency. So parts of the world are less civil than they were 15 years ago. Of course, we could have a long discussion about the validity of these measures, but it's the best we can do. We don't have better data. That's Europe, and Europe too is not necessarily a more civil place in 2016 compared to where it was at the beginning of this century. INGO membership. I'm skimming through this because I want to come to the key story here. Right? That's INGO membership. We take the log to take care of the small country effect. So what we find is that for those countries, these are the countries for which we have data. Right? We have decreases in 24 countries. We define decrease by 2% of a drop in the index value. It's arbitrary, but if it's 2, and it's between 0 and 2 either way, we said it's fairly stable. But the 2 stars mean that there's more than a 10% change, and many of the countries do have more than 10% changes. So, and that includes countries you wouldn't quite expect to be there. We also had increases, right, in exactly 24 countries again, and some of the countries surprise you, right? Others you would say, oh yes, of course, right? South Africa is basically, well, politically we could talk about South Africa endlessly, but I think as a country, when it comes to values of civility, it is on the right track, as are some of the Central and Eastern European countries. So So we have countries that really drop quite dramatically. These are the ones that were above average in their index in the early 2000s and are now below. That includes Japan, the Czech Republic, Malta, Greece, Italy, and Albania. And those countries that were below average are now above average, as Mexico, Poland, Chile, right? and so on. Others stay in the basement, and others stay on the first floor very proudly. And these are also fairly large groups, but there has been movement. Now the question is, what's behind that, right? And we began, and I should really say, we began looking at how can we predict variation in the value of the index over time with what kind of independent variables. We haven't finished the analysis, but it points to the importance of the rule of law quite clearly. Now, once you see it, it's not surprising. But whenever you had countries where there are deficiencies with the rule of law, it doesn't mean that you abolish the rule of law and there's no longer a freedom of association. But if you begin to tinker with it, right, if you begin to tinker with it, it will have an effect. Right there. So we also found, this is the continuation of that. Then we looked at where are the countries where the space for civil society has actually shrunk. Right? Looking at aspects of freedom of association, rule of law, and you find that this is quite a significant development. There is indeed a shrinking space for NGOs in significant number of countries. And that should really concern us. And I think that some countries have not moved up in the index, others have moved down because they were affected by it. Russia is probably the most the clearest example here, but there are others where the shrinking space, or the way the shrinking space comes about, is far more subtle. Hungary is an example. Right? India would be an example, Malawi, and so on. And in the 1990s and the 2000s, we didn't quite anticipate this shrinking. We kind of assumed, naively perhaps, that the rule of law, once established, will stay. We didn't think that it would be possible in the modern age to reverse it again, right? Perhaps we were all too impressed by the events of 1989. Perhaps we were impressed by, now looking back, sometimes rather naive diagnosis, but like the end of history and so on, right? But the battle for the rule of law has not been won. That's what this chart is telling us, right? We spent a lot of time presenting it, but what we try to do here is to see, if the space is restricted, right, the real space for physical NGOs, do we see more movement into cyberspace? Right? Irrespective of the fact that they can block internet traffic, as some, like China sometimes. But there are always ways to get into a country, and everybody knows that that's happening. And that seems to be the case, but the NGOs that are in the center, they're not doing that to a great extent. But it's these, the dark causes. Right? They have a lot of followers, much more. So Anonymous has millions of people, and they're not only in the West, they're distributed quite nicely. So we think that the online presence of NGOs it's a typo there, is expanding, while the actual space in a country, in terms of the rule of law and rules of freedom of association, freedom of expression, is shrinking. Right? So what we find in 2016 The expansion of the infrastructure has slowed, but it's not declining. But we can no longer say that transnational NGOs are growing by leaps and bounds, the way we could say well into the 2000s. But important form developments continue. I did show you some aspects of it, right? The federation. But much of it will happen in cyberspace. The Civil Society Index analysis shows a very uneven performance across countries and regions. The value shift, kind of this post-materialist value shift that Engelhardt and others talked about, has stalled, and in some countries we're going backward. So being less welcoming as a society to outsiders. For example, participation has not increased, and regional national identities have become stronger. And it all points, I think, in the analysis to the importance of debate, or that we have to be mindful of the basic liberties and the rule of law that we took for granted 15 years ago when we started this kind of analysis at the London School of Economics. So we have to go back to it and have to understand why is it that the rule of law is no longer to be taken for granted, and what can we do about it? That if you then look at the development of global civil society over a longer period, going back to the 1970s, recall that at the beginning I said that in the 1970s you had this beginning of an explosion, right? Suddenly all of these NGOs come up. What can we say? So 1970s, medium growth, and most of the NGOs that worked internationally were learned societies, research institutions, but economic interests were quite pronounced. And the innovation at that time was Amnesty International, right? Founded in the 60s, but Amnesty really grew into the organization we know today in the 1970s. And you see particular value changes associated with it and what happened to the participation of people at that time. It was very Western focused in the 1970s. And then in the 80s, we do get an acceleration of the growth, and it's value-based. The 80s, in many ways, were all the decade of the social movements. You can think of Greenpeace as the quintessential 1980s NGO. Right? But cosmopolitan values were rising at that time, and participation increased across the West and reaching into Central and Eastern Europe by the end of the decade. Now, the 1990s were the heyday, in many ways. What we took for granted might have been the exception, that we have high growth in civil society organization internationally. It's both value-based and service provision. And the big form innovation at that time was the corporate NGO that really operates transnationally, right? Like Oxfam, right? And then it changes. We have a moderation of growth in the 2000s. The events of September 11 happened. There was also, many of you may recall, a quite pronounced anti-globalization movement in the early 2000s that was cut short by the events of September 11. And the social forum phenomenon that I described at the beginning is a result out of that. Porto Alegre happened because there was Davos and similar events. And now and you can think of the World Social Forum as the quintessential civil society institution in terms of a form innovation back then. And now it's clearly web-based activism, slower growth of conventional NGOs, and we are just in the middle of the decade, just a bit over it. And I'm not sure whether we are seeing politics come back into transnational civil society. Very likely we will, because the shrinking space has to be opened again, and you can only do that if you become not only an advocate for your own cause, but also a more political actor in the end. So it'd be very interesting to see what happens in the next 5 to 10 years to this transnational space. But what seems clear is that the optimism, perhaps unjust optimism we had in the late 90s and early 2000s did not bear out in reality. So there's a bit of a realism that I share with you, but it's not all bad news. It's more like a caution to watch out for certain developments that we may not be happy about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anheier, for that masterful yet sobering overview. To invite further reflection and insight on these issues, Helmut is now joined by our panelists. Dr. Sharik Siddiqui, an alumnus of our PhD and an MA Philanthropic Studies degrees, is Executive Director of the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action, better known as ARNOVA. He's the former Executive Director of the Islamic Society of North America and has significant experience with NGOs around the world. Next to him is Dr. Greg Witkowski. He is Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies at our school. A historian, his primary research interests are the relationships among philanthropic aid, civil society, and democracy. He focuses his study on Germany and leads the school's Berlin Study Abroad program. Following the panel discussion, we will invite questions and comments from the audience. Sharik, would you please begin? Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Pasek and Professor Anheier. It's really an honor and a privilege to be invited. I've been reading your work for years, and this is my first opportunity to actually meet you in person, so it's been a real pleasure. And I'm going to keep my remarks short just to give more time for Greg and the question and answers, but there are three things that struck me from your presentation and the work that ARNOVA is doing over the last couple of years. Just a little preface on that. ARNOVA is working primarily in Africa. We received a grant from the Ford Foundation to look at how we can strengthen civil society in Africa through focus on research. And that 2-year effort has resulted in the incubation of a new association called the Association for Research on Civil Society in Africa. It'll be Africa-based, Africa-led, but ARNOVA serves as the interim secretariat. And then the other, we've been actively engaged in places like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and in China, and all have some similar themes to some of the things that you've presented today. So the three major points that came to me was, one is, I think, this term civil society. And I thought that was really useful to when you looked at first the Gellner definition and Keene definition, and then transition to the definition that you came up with, because I think your definition in this shrinking space of civil society, largely because of political reasons, provides more opportunity. So one of the interesting things I found was that in countries where, for example, in Saudi Arabia, where you have much more extensive state control, they use the word philanthropy really interchangeably to civil society. Civil society is seen as really about advocacy and political movements, and so that's not a good term there. But their philanthropy is used largely to encompass all the ideas that your definition would incorporate. In Africa, civil society is embraced. In fact, the association is now named the Association for Research on Civil Society because they felt that was the most encompassing. But what's interesting even there is, the concerns of politicization there as well resulted in the founders of AROXA to register both in Indianapolis as a 501c3 and in Nigeria. So you want to make sure that you have your eggs in two baskets because there is this concern. But the civil society, so that was one thing that I thought was an interesting sort of anecdotally that I thought was that was interesting. The term that philanthropy, civil society, third sector, nonprofit, NGO are used interchangeably, largely because based on the perceptions of both government, but of both individuals in that region. The second thing that I thought that I was struck by was, how the political sector and its growth defines how civil society will grow. So much more web-based and so on, and we've seen that in China, for example, and in Saudi Arabia. And then the third thing is this idea that the world is, I think your earlier presentation earlier on, is how the world is becoming much more, it used to be north-centered, but now the world can choose, just like Oroksa did, they chose to be both African as well as, so those boundaries seem to be less. And, those are the three things that's.
Thank you. I appreciate as well the opportunity to speak today, and it's an honor to do so. And I've been reading your work for quite a while, and you may notice some of the influence on it. I had, even before he started with this, had as a topic rule of law. So, so I figure that is an important theme to address. And so I will resist as a historian the temptation to go back to the 1700s and talk about evolution of the rule of law, but we'll want to say just a couple of quick things related to it. One is this idea of law related to power and authority, right? So within a domestic situation, authority is often exercised through law, right? And so you have the authority of a government that can exercise itself in that way. Internationally, we have far fewer legal connections between one another that regulate, right? So what we have instead quite often is power, right? Which is often exercised through military might, through economic means, much more, aggressive in its approach. And so one of the things I think when I look at this and look at civil society, and I think about it both domestically and then think about it more internationally in terms of global civil society, is exactly how do we deal with this issue of power? And it strikes me that the 70s were a critical turning point in terms of both the growth of INGOs, in terms of the growth of global economic, so multinational corporations, global economic reach, and in the terms of violence. So we have the beginning of sort of terrorists and non-state actors really beginning to take hold much more in the 1970s. And so I think as we think about this and the role of nonprofit organizations, INGOs, as we deal with the issue of power, it strikes me that one of the things we do need to cope with and think about is the idea of violence. And so in the 1970s, the World Council of Churches supported, and this may strike you as surprising, the World Council of Churches, which is basically a mainline Protestant organization, supported a program to combat racism. And that included supporting organizations that were listed as terrorists. And basically their argument was this, that there is oppressive violence and liberating violence. And what they argued was that if you have a system that's inherently violent against those under them, apartheid, it would be wrong to stand by and not at least allow for the option of organizations to use violence. Right? So one of the things that was very controversial and ultimately, but did continue until the end of apartheid. So it was a program that did continue as part of the World Council of Churches up into the 90s. And afterwards, Oliver Tambo said, we understood the amount of money, he was a member of the ANC, we understood the amount of money that we were getting wasn't a great deal, but the moral support that we got was really important as we fought against this unjust system. And so it was an issue in which this idea of power was really identified by nonprofits. Now I bring that up, not condoning violence or violence as an approach, but what I'm saying is nonprofit organizations are dealing in a global environment in which power matters, and need to, in some ways, relate to that. And so that's, I think, one element of the rule of law to address.
Shall we open it up to the audience?
There are microphones in the ceiling, so they said we would be fine without microphones.
So, thanks for the talk. I'm a doctoral student from the Dini Family School of Philanthropy. Actually, years ago, I did a project on translational civil society, and I remember my professor was Dr. Lankowski, and he suggested me to look at the key incidents during those kind of civil society movements. And I see the data here you presented is like 1 decade, like early 2000, and then the presentation of the early 2010. So how do you account for the events and incidents happening during this time of period, which may have influenced, for example, the tolerance towards immigrants? Take a recent example is the refugee crisis in Germany. So before that, under like the government's agenda and propaganda, I think people have a more friendly attitude towards refugees. But after some crimes reported by those refugees, the whole society just kind of being hostile towards the refugees. So if you take surveys before and after, those key time points, you will see a really different attitude change. So I just don't know, like, I think it's kind of tricky to see, like, okay, here is the cutoff point for every country we are going to investigate for the change of civil society. So have you ever considered of those maybe isolated incidents happen in different countries and how that will affect your landscape of the civil society?
Should I respond to that? It's, I mean, systematically you would have to. Is this on? You would have to do an event history analysis to follow up that systematically. We did, as part of the yearbook, the Global Civil Society yearbook, we tracked events in civil society, but we did not track events happening outside that affected civil society. So to answer your question, no, we haven't done that. But you can think about it yourself. An event that had an impact when on the whole thing, the whole notion of globalization of civil society was the demonstration in Geneva in June of 2001, when we had the first fatalities of the anti-globalization movement. And had September 11 not happened, this would have been a very, very important turning point. Because, Seattle happened in the late 90s. When were the demonstrations in Seattle, the anti-globalization movement in Seattle, I think it was 1998. Yeah, 1998. And that was pivotal. And the next one, the whole globalization movement turns violent. September 11 was another. And with September 11, you had from the Treasury certain measures taken to prevent terrorist networks using NGOs and foundations as conduits for funding. That had an impact. But on the other side, you had the expansion of the European Union eastward, and with that, the rule of law established in 13 or 10 additional countries according to the acquis communautaire of the European Union. So you can take these events, but singular events are unlikely to change it, but it's smaller ones, right? Where you take a bite at the rule of law, for example, and then you take another one, and you take another one. So kind of, it's more like a drip, rather than a massive shift. And that's why I disagree with what you said about the events in Germany. You must refer to New Year's Eve at Cologne rail station, right? It was a very unfortunate event. Everybody agrees to that. where I disagree is that and it's not about civil society now, but you said the mood in the country turned anti-immigrant. It's not true, right? So the population surveys that are published do see greater reservations, but they are not affecting mainstream society. But it's very, very important that you do not overestimate newspaper reporting that sometimes happens. Right. And by the way, the refugee crisis is not in Germany. The refugee crisis is in Syria and Turkey. Right? And Germany, unfortunately, is one of the only countries at the receiving end. And it's in the country itself, there is no crisis when it comes to the refugees. Germany has 82 million people, and if you add 1 million refugees, it's not going to put the country into a crisis. It has fairly solid institutional infrastructures, the administration functions, and it has a vibrant civil society. They can absorb 1 million refugees. But what has happened, and I leave it at that, is that because Angela Merkel came out very strongly and without consulting other European Union partners and without consulting very much internally with her coalition partners, she has created uncertainties, political uncertainties. And that then translated, or it was a gift to populists, and they're taking advantage of that. So what you have happened is an opening of the political spectrum on the right. So for the first time, not the first time, for the third or fourth time in democratic German history, you have an opening on the right for political parties, which I think was totally unnecessary. But then you probably have to accept the fact that most advanced democracies, consolidated democracies, have between 5 and 15% of the electorate being on the right. And in Germany, they just were covered by the Merkel party, but she was seen as moving to the left, and she opened up that political opportunity structure. It's probably a longer answer than you expected. But I had to correct that question.
Okay. Helmut, I'm wondering if you can comment on a thought that came to mind when you were talking about the rule of law, and that is that I was thinking about David Hammack and Steve Heidemann's book on kind of the projections of institutional logics, and wondering if you had any thoughts about, I guess what I've noticed, which is somewhat an increasing distrust of NGOs in different parts of the globe, partly because they're, obviously funded from international donors, and so that can get that can have a lot of different consequences. But that book kind of captures some of those consequences, and I didn't know if you had thoughts about whether there was a relationship maybe between that kind of way that the post-89 civil society unfolded and what we're seeing now. If there is any kind of relationship between the way that civil society was funded and the kinds of institutions that were sprouting up and the ways that pro-democracy was supported and the I guess the growing distrust of those kinds of NGOs, and at the same time, of course, you have the flip movement of these internet-based, phenomenon happening at the same time.
You're right. There is a backlash against NGOs, not only in. Can you hear me like that? Or?
Yeah.
There's a backlash against NGOs, but it's largely against the corporate NGOs, kind of the 1980s NGOs that are now quite large and they're quite professional. Right? And they were originally seen as an alternative to governments. Governments were seen as corrupt, and in development aid in Africa, you wanted to bypass particular local governments. And that's why the NGOs, I think they're probably doing an okay job, but then if you if you're seen as an alternative to government, government is not going to be like you forever. And the new activists coming in, they see the NGOs as something from yesterday. It's not you're not a new kid on the block anymore. You've been around for a while.
I remember reading this article about an NGO or civil society organization in India that started calling itself a social movement rather than calling itself an NGO, in part, I think, in response to what you're suggesting.
How do you think about Greg's argument about power? It's still in the back of my mind. I find it very, very intriguing that social movements are ultimately about something about power, right? Because they want to it's not about the power of the state, but it's the power of the mobilization power, that movement to move political agendas. That's what you mean, right? And do you think NGOs, when the new platforms, the attacks and the occupies and anonymous, do you think they have the capacity of this mobilization power that we associate with the older movements, with the normal social movement? That's what I'm debating with now. So I'd be interested to hear also from others. What do you think is the capacity of these internet platforms to move political agendas?
I've got a question. It kind of relates to that. If exactly what you're counting when you're counting number of NGOs, because you put up all these maps that says Oxfam has got places all over the place, Landmines has got places all over the place. Are you counting each of these individual affiliates, or are you just counting the parent? And are you looking in any way at financial heft? Because I'm finishing up my dissertation, and I'm looking at changes in ages and what charities do and how much fundraising, how much private support they receive, and I'm finding very strong correlations between age and what they do to the amount of money that they're attracting. And it's really, what you're presenting is a classic case of an industry build-out where you have everybody running and say, oh wow, we can solve this problem with this idea, and all these tangential problems, and all of a sudden you run out of causes. And so I'm not sure what you're counting, and what you're seeing might just be a natural progression of any industry, even in a global sense.
What we count in the sum of the maps, like the number of it's really the number of NGOs that are tracked by this Union of International Organizations. They counted only once. So when I showed you the map of Friends of the Earth, or the International Coalition for that, they're counted only once, so the affiliates are not counted.
Okay.
But you could do that. But then you get a measure of organizational scope or complexity of it if you count the number of affiliates. Financial flows, I looked at that in another project. Quite difficult to track, but the larger NGOs, they're quite good at financial reporting by now. You could do it.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, so.
So, in thinking about power and moving things along, my question is, do you have any sense of how representative these INGOs are in terms of the residents on the ground in these countries, especially in places where internet is blocked off or there isn't the accessibility to internet infrastructure, and that might be where the movement is. And I know where there's internet but it's blocked off, there are ways around that, but sort of how representative, and part of the reason why I'm asking this is you mentioned Keane, and in documentary After Democracy, he talks about how a lot of these are NGOs, not specifically INGOs, but sometimes they take on the appearance of being NGOs for the people that are actually quasi-governmental arms that work against the civil society movement. So do you have any sense of how connected these international movements are to local agendas, local civil society desires or movements, especially in places where the platform doesn't necessarily meet the infrastructure on the ground?
As part of this, no, we didn't track that. These connections, right, from the national to international to the national to the local. No, we didn't do that. In terms of how representative are they? They're clearly not representative. And Keane and Gallon would argue representation is really not the point. They're being representative, right? But what you want to do, you want to open up space for many voices, right? And some are heard better than others.
Well, we're unfortunately at the end of our time here, but we can continue our conversation formally in the lobby. So please join me in thanking Helmut.